If you ask where a soul, or even a ghost, comes from, I have to confess I don't really know. Perhaps they've existed since life first emerged, or even earlier. Everything in this world possesses a spirit, though not everyone can sense it. For centuries, this has been a topic of endless debate. Ever since I began working in this field, not only have my beliefs been upended, but even my long-held view of these entities as ferocious and terrifying has been challenged. Our very existence is far from a mere coincidence, and the world each of us sees might be completely different. I recall when I was just starting out with my master. He once picked up a pear and asked me, "What is this?" I answered, "It's a pear." Then he asked, "What does a pear look like?" I replied, "It has yellow skin with tiny black spots and looks a bit like a small gourd." My master agreed that this was exactly how he would describe it. However, he also told me that the yellow I recognize might not be the same yellow others see. Perhaps in my mind, yellow represents a fixed hue, but in someone else's world, the same color might appear as green or red, and yet that person would call it yellow. Similarly, when I see a person with two eyes, a nose, and a mouth, they see me the same way. Yet we never really question whether the two in our description is the same concept as everyone else's. When my master explained this to me, I was initially confused. But on reflecting further, I found his words made a lot of sense. It reminded me of something my teacher once said in school, that a snake might see us humans as a lump of red, or a dragonfly might see us with 6 overlapping images with scientific evidence backing these ideas. They suddenly became undeniably plausible. This partly explained why some people have a sixth sense for the supernatural while I never did. I fully understood this concept during a business project in 2004, when I realized that even though our lives intersect with others, there might exist an entire world acknowledged only by ourselves. In 2004, a friend from Guangzhou, about 10 years my senior, who had once worked with his father running a dental clinic in Guangzhou before expanding his business to operate a chain in Chongqing, approached me with a request. I owed him a favor ever since he had personally fixed one of my teeth, so I knew he cared about me. This time, however, he reached out because of another friend. He mentioned that his friend, Mr. Ma, a college mate, who, after studying medicine for a few years, but failing to secure a job in a hospital, returned to his hometown of Fengdu to open a restaurant, was facing a haunted restaurant situation. At first, I found his story rather amusing. I teased him, asking if perhaps a starving ghost had come looking for a meal. He assured me that wasn't the case. In fact, he was planning to visit his chain store in Fengdu soon and thought I could join him. He promised to arrange a meeting with Mr. Ma so we could discuss the situation face to face. As for the fee, he said, "Money isn't an issue, as long as you don't do anything too shady." The mention of money made me feel as though my life had suddenly brightened. To be honest, I had returned to Chongqing in early 2002 and had been taking on small jobs ever since, earning just enough to scrape by. I consoled myself that these lean years were building my experience and reputation, and indeed, locally I was considered a promising talent. Yet, those years were undeniably tough. My master once told me that during the high times one should relish success, and in the low times one should still savor life. I clung to his words, even if it meant living modestly for several years. Then everything changed with this particular job. Soon after, I bought a house, a car, and began living a life of feigned contentment and ease. I agreed to my friend's request, and the very next day, I rode in his car to Fengdu. Although I had heard about Fengdu during my years in Chongqing, it was my first visit. This small town on the Yangtze wasn't famous for its pickle bean curd, but rather for its legendary status as a 1,000-year ghost town. As a child, whenever I got into mischief, sneaking into the river with friends, racing down narrow streets with cars, or climbing ladders on chimneys. If my mom ever found out, she'd exclaim, "Are you planning to check in at Fengdu?" From then on, I subconsciously associated Fengdu with misfortune. I had heard that Fengdu was renowned for its ghostly atmosphere, with legends of the underworld, the Bridge of Helplessness, and the road to the Yellow Springs. During my studies in Yunnan, I even discussed this topic with my master, who told me there had never been a true ghost town. Wherever life exists, death follows, and where there is death, ghosts inevitably linger. In that sense, every place is a ghost town, filled with ghostly stories, supernatural handiwork, and mournful howls. And that applies abroad as well. I even asked my master if foreigners have ghosts too, and he humorously replied, "Do you really think ghosts exist only in Asia? Then Asians must have it particularly tough." From that point, I began partitioning my worldview, reserving a special realm for ghosts, entities that overlap and intersect with our time and space, residing in dimensions we neither know nor can see. My master also explained that Fengdu's reputation as a ghost town actually arose from a misunderstanding. Before Chongqing became a municipality, the entire eastern Sichuan region, including areas that are now western Hunan, western Hubei, and northern Guizhou, was deeply influenced by ancient Bashu and eastern shamanistic cultures. During the Shang dynasty, it was already the center of activity for the Ba people. Among them was a branch called the Dichang, who, due to conflicts with the Shang, split from other Ba tribes and attempted to escape along the Yangtze toward what is now Wuhan. However, while passing through Yudu, present-day Fengdu, they paused because the sixth son of their tribal leader, Tubo, was born. At that time, Yudu was merely a small ancient Chang village. When Tubo requested land from the village chief to settle his people and troops, the Chang refused. Enraged, Tubo led 800 Dichang warriors on a nighttime raid, killing almost everyone except women, the elderly, and children. He then forced the surviving Chang to labor in constructing a fort on a hillside. After settling there and realizing the location's strategic advantage, Tubo decided to stay. The Shang dynasty had just fallen, and the Zhou monarch, busy quelling rebellions, paid him little attention. With the traditional Shu people scattered by warfare, Tubo felt he was destined for greatness and declared himself king in Yudu, calling himself the Ghost Emperor. The Dichang were descendants of three branches that had split from the ancient Chang during the era of Yan and Huang. Over time, these groups evolved into the Chang, the ancient Chang, and the Han, whose combination eventually gave rise to the Basha civilization. Tubo's massacre of the Chang village was not only an act of rebellion, but also a betrayal of his ancestral teachers. For a long time afterward, because Tubo called himself the Ghost Emperor and named his people the Ghost Clan, Yudu gradually transformed into a ghost town. In truth, what they revered at that time wasn't actual ghosts, but shamans. Only later, through the passage of time and cultural interactions, did this small village grow into the world-renowned divine palace of the ghost country. On the journey to Fengdu, my imagination was fueled by images from a bird's-eye view of New Chongqing, of a colossal mountain deity, various ancient demons and ghosts with long tongues, headless hanging specters, severed-headed apparitions, and little pointed-eared monsters who had met gruesome fates. There were even tales of reanimated corpses in Qing dynasty attire that rose from coffins in a fit of unexpected passion. Yet when I arrived, I discovered that aside from the unique charm typical of a ghost town, this quaint county was nearly identical to the city I lived in. Compared to the concrete jungle of my home, I found myself inexplicably drawn to this place. Once in Fengdu, my friend called Mr. Ma, and he even took me out for a meal in the town. My friend insisted that one must try the white-cut chicken in Fengdu. Although I often ate white-cut chicken at home, it never tasted as good because of the dipping sauces. The version I had in Fengdu turned out to be the best I'd ever eaten. During the meal, Mr. Ma also arrived at the restaurant. Since we were in a private room with the door closed, we could talk freely. After eating and without hurrying to pay, I asked Mr. Ma to recount the events he'd experienced. He explained that about a year earlier he had taken over a restaurant from someone else. The previous owner had run the place so successfully that its reputation was well established locally. For some unknown reason, that owner decided to transfer his business. Mr. Ma, who happened to have some spare money and was eager to break into the restaurant industry, quickly negotiated terms and signed the transfer contract. He even kept the restaurant's name and chef unchanged so as to preserve the authentic flavor and benefit from the previous owner's reputation. However, after roughly 6 months, business began to plummet. I asked him if the decline was due to changing the chef, since as a person who cares about taste, if a restaurant changed its cooking style, I wouldn't return. Mr. Ma replied that aside from the waiters and himself, nothing had changed. It was because some customers started causing a disturbance by claiming that the restaurant was haunted. Once word spread, everyone became frightened and stopped coming. Mr. Ma detailed the incident. In the first 6 months after reopening, customers kept coming unaware of the change in ownership. Then one night, 3 customers, a pair of men and a woman, came in for a late-night snack. When their food was served, they noticed that all the plates and bowls contained paper replicas of ancient ingot money. They felt they were being mocked by the restaurant staff and began shouting at the server. In the ensuing commotion, one of them grabbed a plate and swung it at the server, but the plate somehow pierced right through the person and crashed to the floor. One customer, thinking his eyes were deceiving him, went over and threw a punch, only to find his hand passing through what he assumed was a person. Then the server suddenly seemed to melt away entirely. Terrified, they assumed they had encountered a ghost and fled in panic. The woman, while escaping, was even struck by a car. A few days later, the 3 customers returned with a crowd, demanding compensation and an explanation, handing out flyers that declared the place haunted. Eventually, the police arrived to calm everyone down. Even though the police managed to quell the disturbance, the damage was done. The incident spread widely, and even long-time customers stopped coming. Business deteriorated day by day until the restaurant was on the verge of closing. Listening to him, I deduced that this kind of ghost, which appears suddenly, makes itself known and then vanishes as if melting away, is known in our field as the suspended spirit. Despite the spirit in its name, it's actually a low-level ghost commonly spoken of in the Yunnan Guizhou Sichuan region. Its low-level nature means it often appears unexpectedly, sometimes even showing the moment of its disappearance. Such a ghost forms because there is something in this world that cannot be let go, not merely an obsession, but an inability to relinquish. The process of its formation is fraught with conflict and entanglement. When it becomes a ghost, it's in a state of mental confusion. Unlike those ghosts that only descend into a state of muddled existence after 49 days, the suspended spirit typically belongs to someone with a troubled life, who, after its appearance, repeats actions common in life without realizing they're dead. And once it realizes it's a ghost, it contorts and vanishes, only to reappear later with no recollection of its previous manifestation. This cycle continues indefinitely, unless its energy is completely exhausted or it encounters a particularly dashing ghost hunter. It is important to note that these ghosts are completely harmless. People fear them solely because of their ghostly identity. I then asked Mr. Ma if he had ever fired any waiters or runners who might have later died without his knowledge. He replied that ever since he took over the restaurant, he had kept the entire original staff from the previous owner. I pressed further, asking if anyone else besides those few unruly customers had seen anything, noting that the chef, who cooks the food, should have noticed to whom he was serving. Mr. Ma gave a rueful smile and said, "The problem is my restaurant closes at midnight and no one stays behind. Those customers claimed they arrived around 3 a.m. when the doors were locked tight. No one was inside. I have no idea how they got in, and thus how they encountered a ghost. That's when I realized not only had this ghost served paper ingots as a dish, but it had also apparently opened the door to help Mr. Ma's business." I had never heard such a story before. Unable to piece together a clear explanation, I asked Mr. Ma to take my friend and me on a tour of the restaurant. My friend excused himself, saying he had to check on his dental clinic and would join us later for dinner. Knowing he was also a foodie And with Mr. Ma being in the restaurant business, I was even more eager to uncover the mystery. Mr. Ma's restaurant was located along a street on top of a small mound. It wasn't in a busy area, but it wasn't secluded either. In Chongqing, many small eateries like this exist. While hard to find, they offer incredibly delicious food. As the saying goes, good wine needs no bush. A good reputation attracts customers regardless of location. The restaurant was housed in a two-story building with the second floor reserved for private dining. On the exterior wall hung a neon sign bearing the restaurant's name. Once inside, I noticed that the chef and waitstaff were all dozing in the nearly empty dining hall. I asked Mr. Ma, "Could you let everyone have some time off? There are some things here I'd rather not have everyone see." Mr. Ma then sent the kitchen staff home. After everyone left, we closed the door, sprinkled some grave soil in the corners of the room, and I began using a compass to search for traces of ghosts. It wasn't surprising to find evidence of a ghost in the kitchen, dining hall, and cashier's area. I detected the presence of one ghost as indicated by the compass's reaction. I put the compass away and told Mr. Ma, "Old Ma, your place is definitely haunted. Judging by the distribution of these traces, it seems this ghost is deeply connected to your restaurant, almost as if it's very familiar with this place. Let's think. Who has been here recently? Who left? Did any of them die?" Mr. Ma was firm in his response. "Absolutely not. All my employees came over with me from the previous owner." At that point, both of us thought of the former owner. Mr. Ma even suggested that perhaps something had happened during the previous owner's tenure, something that led him to experience hauntings, and then, foreseeing the impact on business, decided to transfer the restaurant to me. I replied, "That's possible. Business people tend to keep secrets, much like when you rent an apartment. Even if someone died there and you aren't told, you still move in. But if you're informed that someone met a violent end in that place, no one would want to live there." I then suggested inviting the former owner back for a meal as an excuse to get him to talk and perhaps reveal something. Mr. Ma agreed and immediately called the former owner. The old owner, Mr. Zhang, said he was actually looking forward to having a meal and visiting his old staff. We then remembered that we had sent the staff home earlier, so Mr. Ma hurriedly called them back under the pretext that Mr. Zhang wanted to dine with everyone. By around 7 p.m., night had fallen. My friend arrived from his clinic, and the staff returned to the restaurant, prepared the food, and even placed a sign at the door stating that the restaurant would be closed for the day. Everyone waited quietly for the former owner's arrival. At about 7:30, Mr. Zhang arrived. After greeting Mr. Ma with a handshake, he remarked, "Buddy, why is the neon sign outside broken?" Mr. Ma laughed and said, "It's always been broken. We've fixed it countless times, even calling a lighting company to completely rewire it, but two of the characters on the sign still wouldn't light up. In the end, it didn't matter because the restaurant's reputation and loyal customers kept it afloat." Mr. Zhang sighed and said he still had a deep affection for the restaurant. He then smiled as he looked at the chefs and waitstaff gathered around our table. I could tell that when Mr. Zhang was running the restaurant, he treated his employees very well. Otherwise, they wouldn't have come back so quickly or worked so diligently for the new owner. So, the new owner, the old owner, the loyal staff, along with my friend and me, enjoyed a pleasant meal together. After dinner, everyone dispersed. Mr. Ma stayed behind with Mr. Zhang, saying they needed to talk. I sensed that Mr. Zhang was just as uninformed about the haunting as we were, given his demeanor. Once the door was closed, we gathered in the dining hall. Mr. Ma carefully recounted every detail, and Mr. Zhang was visibly shocked. He could never have imagined such things would happen in his old restaurant. When Mr. Ma asked if any employees or longtime customers had died while he was running the place, Mr. Zhang said, "None." Then after a pause, he added, "Well, during that time, my wife passed away. That's exactly why I decided to stop running the restaurant." Mr. Zhang went on to explain that the restaurant's name is composed of 3 characters. The first comes from his own name, the second from his wife's, and the third character, Yuan, was chosen by the couple. He then pointed to the neon sign outside and said, "The character that never lights up is my wife's name." At that moment, it seemed we all understood what was implied. Mr. Zhang grew emotional and asked, "Do you think my wife's ghost has returned?" We all fell silent. This was the answer. A man in his 50s began to weep bitterly. Mr. Ma handed him a cigarette to console him, while I silently reflected. Everything indicated that the 3 unfortunate customers had seen Mrs. Zhang's ghost. Yet, I wasn't ready to say it outright. 2 questions still troubled me. First, were the kitchen, dining hall, and cashier's area the places where Mrs. Zhang had appeared most frequently when she was alive? Second, if the restaurant was locked at night, how did those customers get inside? I asked Mr. Zhang if his wife used to personally cook and serve the food, and whether she was also in charge of the cash register. He confirmed that she did. He himself mainly assisted occasionally and socialized with regular customers over drinks to show his appreciation. With that settled, the only remaining mystery was how the customers had entered after closing. I told Mr. Zhang, "I'm here to guide your wife's spirit out. Since it appears that the ghost is your late wife, do you want me to send her off now, or?" Wiping away his tears, he replied, "Let me have one more look at her." With that brief statement, I decided that no matter what, he must see her with his own eyes. In Fengdu County, I learned from Mr. Ma about an herbal medicine shop that never closed, open 24 hours. My friend and I immediately headed there. Since Mrs. Zhang didn't appear every night, waiting could mean a long delay, which wouldn't be good for her. I needed to buy several medicinal herbs to mix with incense, hoping to lure her ghost out that very night. By the time I returned to the restaurant with the herbs, it was nearly midnight. We lit the incense in the dining hall, and as per usual, closed the doors at 12. We then bought some beer and cigarettes and sat at a distance where we could see the restaurant's entrance, waiting quietly. It was around 2 a.m. The streets were nearly deserted. I wasn't sure if it was because locals warn against wandering in a ghost town at night, but aside from us, there wasn't a soul in front of the mound. Suddenly, the neon sign outside lit up completely. I noticed that the character representing Mrs. Zhang seemed to shine even brighter than the others. As we focused on the neon sign, the rolling shutter at the restaurant's entrance slowly opened on its own, and the lights in the dining hall turned on. In that dark street, only this restaurant was illuminated, which explained why those 3 unfortunate customers had managed to get in. I asked Mr. Ma and Mr. Zhang, "Are you ready to go inside with me?" Though they were fearful, they nodded. Only my dentist friend decided to stay at the door. I then led Mr. Ma and Mr. Zhang into the restaurant, and we sat at a table, tense and waiting. What I'm about to describe next might be a bit frightening. I had always assumed that Mrs. Zhang's ghost would emerge from the kitchen. I wasn't even sure I'd see her. But as I focused on the kitchen door, I caught a glimpse at the cashier's counter. A figure slowly stood up, a pale, thin woman with an unsettling smile, holding a menu as she walked toward us. I don't mean to say that Mrs. Zhang's ghost was terrifying, but her unexpected entrance certainly startled me. I could understand, though. After all, she had stayed behind because she couldn't let go. Mr. Ma and Mr. Zhang, facing away from the counter, didn't see her. I quickly signaled to them that she was right behind. Mr. Ma clearly regretted coming inside. He didn't dare to look back, while Mr. Zhang, after all, it was his wife, could not hold back his emotion and began to cry, turning toward the smiling figure of his wife. It was useless, though. She couldn't possibly remember him. At least, not in her current state. The 2 of them exchanged a long, wordless look before Mr. Zhang said, "Bring me some shredded potatoes and twice-cooked pork." Mrs. Zhang's ghost, with her dreamy smile, drifted into the kitchen and soon returned carrying 2 plates filled entirely with paper replicas of ingots and money paper. Needless to say, this was undoubtedly the offering Mr. Zhang had burned for her after her death. Had I been an unaware customer, I might have swung a plate at her. I couldn't react too dramatically since Mr. Zhang hadn't made his move yet, so we waited. Then Mr. Zhang let out a long sigh, cried as he began stuffing the paper ingots into his mouth, though he found them hard to swallow. He paused, gazing at his wife, several times about to speak, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. Finally, with a trembling, tearful voice, he began to sing. On a certain day, in a certain month and year, like a shattered face too broken to say goodbye, let everything drift away. It isn't an easy thing, and we never cried. Let it come softly, let it leave gracefully. Now, year after year, I can't stop missing you, missing the past. At this point, his voice broke into sobs. It seemed that his song made his wife aware that everything had become a memory, that she had long since left this world, perhaps overwhelmed by her inability to accept and struggle against it. The three of us watched helplessly as her figure contorted and vanished. Watching his wife disappear left Mr. Zhang heartbroken. Mr. Ma patted his shoulder in comfort while discreetly wiping tears from his own eyes. I then asked Mr. Zhang, "Now, can I guide your wife's spirit on its way?" Through his tears, he slowly nodded. I asked Mr. Ma to help escort him outside, so he wouldn't have to witness the process. Then I used soy sauce as ink to draw a talisman on the ground, burned the paper ingots she had brought, chanted incantations, invoked her spirit, and finally sent her off. Before all that, I even raised a cup of beer in her honor. Afterward, I collected the ashes, wrapped them in tissue paper, and handed them to Mr. Zhang, instructing him to replace the tissue with red silk at home and place it inside his wife's shoes, so that they would never forget the path they once walked together. The next day, my friend and I left Fengdu. Both Mr. Ma and Mr. Zhang willingly paid me more than I had expected, double the fee, in fact. Later, I learned from my friend that business at the restaurant had improved. Mr. Ma and Mr. Zhang had become partners, jointly running the restaurant under the same name. It seemed that Mr. Zhang had finally moved on and was willing to return to this place filled with memories, and I was truly happy for them. According to congratulatory messages sent by the people of Fengdu, the restaurant is still in business today. If you're interested in my video, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.